Hello everyone. The theme of today's lecture is something that is very close to my heart because it's part of my own history and it's definitely the focus of my own research and my engaged work, and we're talking actually about the current forceful displacement of people and current refugee crisis. So before I start with the lecture, I just want to highlight the major aspects of today's presentation for you. So the first aspect is going to identify the phenomena itself. When we talk about forceful displacement, we usually take into account the atrocities that people try to escape. That means that we identify the major challenge towards the human rights and human life, basically instances of direct violence that is often caused by either institutions or by social agents, militaries, different countries, and so on and so on. And you'll see throughout the lecture that despite the fact that this is one of the important aspects of what actually makes people leave their homes, it is not the only one. It's actually not the deadliest one as well. The second aspect of the lecture will probably focus on the international community and system of laws and regulations that basically create and sustain what we call a refugee discourse. This is mostly embodied through UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and it's up to date the primary institution in the world that deals with forceful displacement within the framework of international law and obligations that international law invokes in third parties. We will see the main nature of this system and of course its limits, and I'm going to spend some time talking like how the refugee system actually looks from the perspective of refugees themselves, and not so much from the kind of ideal standpoint of rules, principles, academic teachings, and theories. Next aspect it's actually very closely related to the second aspect, and this is basically I'm going to try to identify why the system itself is insufficient to kind of address the phenomena that we face in our globalized epoch that we all share today. Then I'm going to switch towards some of the fears of the Western countries and why these countries remain reluctant of actually accepting refugees and asylum seekers, despite the fact that the international law clearly defines ways how these people can actually seek refuge in other countries. And I think I will conclude the lecture itself with few observations from the field and what actually has to be done in order to kind of change the pitfalls that we all find ourselves today as humanitarian agents. So let's start. I'm going to start with the definition of what refugee is, and this is intentional because this definition to some extent highlights the primary phase of the refugee system and discourse, and on the other hand also it highlights limits of such discourse. So let's just read it. Refugees are people fleeing conflict or persecution. They are defined and protected in international law and must not be expelled or returned to situations where their life and freedom are at risk. So you see here these few words, fleeing conflict or persecution. This basically defines what refugees are. This definition clearly defines that refugees are considered people only individuals who are actually escaping direct violence or threat to their lives by violent conflict, atrocities, and agency of other people. So that in itself limits the scope what one can actually consider refugee. and this also limits the scope of and range of obligations that the countries have towards those people who want to immigrate from their own countries into other. I'm going to talk more about that later in the lecture, but for now I just want you to kind of reflect on the question, like, is the violence only thing that makes people leave their homes? I mean, think about poverty, think about environmental degradation, and you'll see that in itself, when we reflect on the conditions that we have now compared to those that we had in like 1940s and 1950s, that the world has changed, that in itself this change demands to some extent redefinition of obligations and principles that actually guide management and aid of people who are forced to leave their homes. Another grim fact of our reality is that every minute, so count of 60, and 24 people were actually forced to leave their homes, taking into account that at least half of these numbers are actually children and minors. Now, you're all familiar with what's going on in Syria, and the whole media attention about refugees and the refugee crisis has received so much public foci only because of this single country that we see so frequently on our laptops, TVs, and we read about it. So what is the situation in Syria? Well, I'm not going to dwell long on it because I'm pretty sure that all of you are familiar with the conflict in Syria, but due to the authoritarian regime and the religious differences within the country, there is a conflict that has led towards massive displacement and massive death of people in once a very secular, very advanced country. When we compare Syria with, for example, other countries in the region, besides Jordan, of course, like Iraq and Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and these kind of more religiously conservative places, Syria was actually very advanced, very secular, kind of more pro-European, had a very high percentage of educated people. Cities were very tolerant, especially when we take the gender oppression. I mean, of course, it was not great, but compared to the neighboring countries and the region itself, it actually did offer a certain atmosphere that was not as oppressive and violent as the neighboring countries. And yet, of course, that's not enough. And really, if you want to talk about the gender oppression, it's a global phenomenon. It's not something that is just kind of tied to specific religion, specific culture. It's predominantly existing everywhere, especially in our own country and amidst our own institutions. But that's a topic for a completely different lecture than this. So I'm going to go back to the refugee crisis. One thing why this conflict made so much gained so much public attention is because it's very close to Europe, and the impact of conflict had a relatively severe consequence of Europe. I'm not trying to kind of highlight the hypocrisy of the Western world, because there are so many other conflicts in the world that we don't even hear about, because to some extent there's no direct impact on this conflict on us. But Syrian conflict has caused something that to some extent has raised many eyebrows in the Western political and humanitarian hemisphere. First of all, there was a massive influx of people from the Middle East towards Europe. That in itself has kind of motivated so much public discourse on what should be done and what actually can be done to kind of protect these people, provide them certain aid, and offer them safety that they cannot really enjoy back home. At the same time, these kind of conditions have highlighted another side of European or Western mentality that is to some extent that parallel with calls for solidarity. There are like increased number of people who try to kind of reinforce divisions and distinctions that exist between different cultures, and increase of right-wing movements all over the usually very tolerant Europe. Um, that in itself just shows the limits of a very important sentiment that kind of guides the international community and humanitarianism itself. Like, what is the nature of solidarity? What are the limits of solidarity? And as soon as we scratch the surface and dig a little bit further, we can see that all these kind of ideal notions kind of start falling apart. And I don't think that's a cause for resignation and fatalism. I actually think that's cause for mobilization of social powers, a mobilization of individuals, and setting a specific goal that we can use to kind of change our own way of thinking and change our own way of acting, and trying to make this world a better place. This may sound naive and idealized, but I think in the face of so many challenges that we face abroad and at our own home and our own country, I think that's the only way we can actually take if we really want to consider ourselves moral agents. Leaving this small rant aside, this map shows the number of refugees, Syrian refugees, only Syrian refugees in the neighboring countries. And this map is very important because to some extent it highlights a very grim fact of international asylum and refugee system, because in theory, these people from Syria can seek asylum everywhere in the world. And in practice, usually they are constrained to the neighboring countries because access to other countries is impossible. And so you could see that there are like 3 million registered refugees in Turkey, and this is not whole number. There are more than 4 million refugees themselves in across the Turkey. Some are in the urban areas like Istanbul here. But these 3 million of Syrian refugees are actually warehoused along Turkish and Syrian border here in the massive number of refugee camps run by Turkish government and UNHCR. Take into account that the numbers we have about displaced people vary, very simple because we are not really sure yet like how many of people who seek refuge are actually Syrians and how many of them are actually coming from other countries in the region and the rest of Asia. But for now you can see that Turkey has the most refugees, followed by Lebanon, a very tiny country. Lebanon, will come to that very soon. Jordan, Iraq and Egypt. Both Iraq and Egypt have a very small number of refugees simply because Iraq is a place of social and political instability itself. So it has a massive number of refugees themselves. And Egypt is geographically a bit removed, so it was impossible for Syrians to seek refuge there. Another thing is that I want you to pay attention is that always this number that we see here is actually proportional to the number of children and minors who are making this a very significant subset of what we actually consider refugee population. And when we talk about children, when we talk about elderly, we talk about people whose agency is actually constrained, who are often deemed like people without choice, who are deemed people who are to some extent delivered to this kind of primary wave of social forces and agency of others, either like parents or children or institutions, an NGO community, government, and so on and so on. But you can see that the number of those who actually demand and require significant amount of aid is very high, because a child needs more attention than actually an adult, especially if you take into account the necessities like education, medical services, and so on and so on. Now, there are so many contradictions about what's really going on the field today. This is Alan Kurdi. Alan Kurdi sadly became a face of the refugee crisis. In the fall of 2015, Alan's boat capsized and he drowned. There was a photo of this young boy head down in the sand of the Turkish beach. The photo made so many headlines and basically created so much attention in the West about the plight of these refugees, and we're going to talk about it more very soon. But for now, I just want to highlight the fact that despite the fact that the image of a dead Syrian boy created so much public attention and uproar, since his death, more than 100 children drowned in Aegean. Talking about Lebanon again, the fact is that the tiny Lebanon, a country with so many of its own problems, there's a political instability, there's a multi-ethnicity, there's always these tensions between the Christian minority and the Muslim majority. There's ongoing conflict with Israel. Israel considers one of the political organizations within Lebanon, Hezbollah, a terrorist organization, as many other international members of community. Very poor country, came to warehouse and help like more than 1 million Syrian refugees compared to 400,000, 500,000 now of refugees in Europe. You could see here the chart with countries that have the most refugees per 1,000 individuals of population, like Lebanon, Jordan, now Turkey and Chad are leading, of course, South Sudan, and you could see like that none of these countries are actually affluent countries, part of the Western Hemisphere. The only two countries from Europe that kind of make the chart are Sweden and Malta, but only because the population number of Sweden and Malta is very small, so even an insignificant number of refugees actually creates this balance that gives an impression that they're actually achieving much in providing safety to these people. This is the current situation only about Syria. So we're going to talk soon about other countries that have produced a significant amount of people who left their homes. So one distinction that I want you to kind of pay attention when we talk about the forceful migration studies is that there are like two kinds of displaced people. At one hand, we had internally displaced people, and 7.6 million of them are still in Syria. Internally displaced people mean that the person has left home but hasn't left the country. So if you can recall the natural disasters in our own country, like last fall, you could see that, for example, states like Texas and Florida, that many people were forced to leave their homes and relocate, either temporarily or permanently. And this is called internally displaced people. So people who are forced to leave their homes, forced to leave their cities and relocate to either neighboring states, neighboring parts of the country, or in some other parts of the same nation. In addition to these 7.6 million, there are like approximately 4.1 million Syrians who have moved to neighboring countries like Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, and so on. And up to date, and this is the old data, that is still kind of pretty relatively actually precise, is that around 350,000 have applied for asylum in Europe. And when we talk about Europe, we talk about Western Europe, some of the most affluent and most stable financially and politically, of course, societies in the world who actually have capacity to provide aid to those people, compared to Lebanon or Egypt or Iraq or even Turkey. When we add almost 4 million Afghanis who were forced to leave their homes, and we know why, what's really going on in Afghanistan since the early 2000s. Then Iraq, almost 3.5 million of people. Many of them are actually internally displaced. Some have escaped to other parts of the world. I mean, this is to some extent number that has left Syria. So if you add those 4 million Syrians, you add this 1 million, you could see that almost 5, eventually 6 million of people are kind of redistributed here in these kind of countries, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. So taking these things into account, these charts do not show some other parts of the world that are considered crisis regions. Also, these charts do not really show locations that are plagued by conflict, that are plagued by poverty, that are plagued by environmental devastation, and so on and so on. So it doesn't show the number of people trying to escape South and Central America. Doesn't show a number of people trying to escape Sub-Saharan Africa due to conflict, increased poverty, or increased environmental degradation. Doesn't show some of the conflicts in Asia, especially when we think about Myanmar and Rohingya minority, and what's really going on in that part of the world. Most of the time, why these things to some extent do not really receive so much public attention is because they're not immediately taking place next to the European borders, and only when such things receive much concern is when actually they have such conditions or such events have direct impact on the general population or the living standards of people who live in these affluent societies. Leaving this aside, I now want to kind of switch to the second aspect of this lecture. So you can take a break here if you want, you continue later, or you can continue as you please. I want to kind of focus on two questions. One is, why is the current international refugee system not working? It's obvious that it's not working based on the fact that geographical location itself determines the fact like which societies will take the most burden of refugees and so on. It's not working because it fails to protect the lives of those most vulnerable, like case of Alan Kurdi and hundreds of other children who have drowned subsequently in Aegean. It doesn't function because it doesn't protect the lives of people who have tried to reach Europe from Africa. There are like more than 33,000 people who have drowned in the Mediterranean Sea due to the lack of action and activity of international community in saving those people, often delivered to the mercy of smugglers who put them on wreckages that are not able to float or sail very far. And of course, I want to give a few suggestions, like what can we do to actually fix the mess that we witness in front of our eyes on a daily basis. So the current refugee system has been designed in the aftermath of the Second World War. It was 1951, and most of the affluent countries and influential countries in the world have kind of come together and designed a set of principles and obligations that allow people who are experiencing direct threat to their lives based on violence and conflict to seek refuge in other countries, and where they will encounter safety, and where they can wait until the conflict in their home countries is over. So, in theory, this is actually an amazing um, endeavor. It identifies discourse, it identifies principles, responsibilities, it ascribes certain way of looking at the world that is actually aimed at helping others. The problem with its system that it's outdated, that it's not really sufficiently effective when it's applied to current globalized epoch that we all live in. I mean, the world in 1940s is different than the world in 2000s. So there are like vast gap of conditions and dangers that this discourse doesn't really take into account, like poverty, like environmental degradation, or global climate change, and so on and so on. So, leaving this aside, I want to focus on telling you like how this refugee system that is part of international law, that is embodied in international institutions and dozen of international conventions and regulations actually really seen, but not from the perspective of these institutions, but also from the perspective of refugees themselves. So here you can see a Syrian family. This is Amal, this is Maram, this is Hussein. These two are Amal's children. This is a Syrian family who have escaped the horror of Syrian war, and they are currently in Istanbul, Turkey. I have met with them last summer, and I have done a range of interviews with them, and that I wanted to use for educational purposes. And I'm gonna tell you like how the refugee system seems from their own perspective. So Amal and her children are from a city of Aleppo in Syria, once a very blooming financial and educational center of Syria. It now looks like this. You could see the ruins, and imagine trying to live a life among such infrastructure. Take into account that we already have started with choices that Amal and her family has, and in my opinion, there are only 4 choices that she, as a person who is imminently facing danger, has. So the first choice that Amal and her family has, and that sadly vast majority of Syrians have taken, is that they can seek refuge in one of the UNHCR run or organized camps. So this is a camp from Turkey. You could see these tents, and these tents are not really large, and you have whole families being kind of mashed together in them without electricity, without any kind of luxuries like air condition, running water, and so on and so on. Just show you like a few more photos. This is the Suruj. It's the largest refugee camp in Turkey. It has around 700,000 Syrian refugees, and you could see like the vast infrastructure that actually exists here. This is Atari. This is largest camp in Jordan. Again, like around 800,000 people are warehoused there. Not only Syrians, but also people from Africa, people from Iraq, and so on and so on. You could see that what really takes place in the refugee camps is basically this. So, as a refugee, in order for you to be officially relocated to third country, you first need to undergo the process of registration. That means that you have to go to the UNHCR run camp. The problem is that the relocation to other countries, so the theory is this. If I'm a refugee from Bosnia, I go to a refugee camp, for example, in Austria, and I seek, I give my account, I share some of my experiences, and I get registered, I get a refugee card, and then basically they send me, either leave me in Austria, or they send me to other country like Germany, Switzerland, France, US, and so on and so on. So this is theoretically something that all people are actually hoping, because no one wants to live in these camps for various reasons that I'm going to identify very soon. But in practice, less than 1% of refugees actually receive this relocation. That means that what really happens is that people spend approximately 10 years in these camps before they can even like return back home or relocate elsewhere. This is how the life in camp actually is. So there's a rudimentary education for children. There are no schools. It's really provisional, mostly run by NGOs. There's no running water. That means there are like specific locations in the camp where you can go and access the water, showers, and so on. You wait for food, often not really. You wait for food for hours, waiting in line with other people, often not actually even receiving any food, because if you're at the end of the line, there are like limited resources, and often like people remain hungry. There's an increased violence towards children and women in these camps. Like 1 in 3 children is actually sexually assaulted. Quite frequently from workers themselves. And one of the people that I have talked to who actually escaped the camp and ended up in Istanbul, an urban area, is that they had buckets that they used to urinate and do other biological processes within the tent, because they didn't want to leave the children outside, because they were afraid that their daughters will be actually raped, because that's how frequently that has actually occurred in these camps. So it's not really surprising that not many Syrians actually want to stay in these camps, because there's no really future in these camps. You cannot work. You're completely delivered to actions of these international agencies, and this is basically what global minimum that David Miller highlights looks like. You have access to water, you have access to food, you have access to shelter and provisional medical aid, but is this really a life you would like to live if you were in their position? So this is from Moria. It's a camp in Greece, Greek island Lesbos. It's actually designed for 2,000 people, but on a daily basis there are like more than 9,000 people there. So you could see that the conditions are terrible. There's a ongoing conflict with security forces. You can see here Greek police. There are like lots of conflicts within the inmates of the camp itself, because there are like different ethnic and religious groups that are increasingly violent and hostile towards each other. So the third alternative that Amal had is the one that she actually chose, and that's basically to kind of avoid refugee camps where, for example, Maram will probably experience some form of sexual gender violence, where her children will not actually have any future. So what Amal decided is to kind of venture into vast urban areas like Istanbul and Beirut, in these neighboring countries, because the narrative, I mean, the expectations are this, that at least there they can find a work and they can actually have a life that will resemble some kind of normality that they had back home. The problem is with this approach is that because they're not registered, they're not considered by Turkish government as citizens, so they don't have work permit, of course, but they can be employed by Turkish business owners as unreported workers, of course, where what basically makes them they're actually prone to mistreatment, exploitation, and they're actually not paid equally as Turkish workers. Often they're not paid at all, especially like from the case of Maram. She was working in a garment factory in one of the urban areas, Istanbul, and she was working like 1 month, 12 hours a day, and at the end of the month she was fired and not paid because the person had so much access to cheap labor that he simply didn't find it feasible to pay for her work. And she was 17 back then. She's now 18 and a half, I think. Take into account that life in urban areas cost money, and that frequently people who reached urban areas either had some savings from before, or they kind of have someone who is living there, like relatives, friends, so they have hope that these people will actually help them settle down and start a normal life. The truth is that savings frequently are depleted very fast, that the support and aid of relatives and friends is very short-term and insufficient, and people often experience urban destitute and violence, especially because the Turkish general population is not really friendly towards refugees. Final choice that Syrian refugees had was basically avoiding refugee camps, avoiding ending up in the urban areas in neighboring countries. They wanted to seek refuge in affluent Western countries. We're going to try to show what's really going on here. So in the first year of the influx of refugees, they were taking this ground route, like from Turkey to Bulgaria or Greece, and according to the international refugee and asylum system, you seek asylum in the first point of entry in European Union, and then after that, after you register, you're free to go wherever you want. So many of these people actually didn't want to stay in Greece and Bulgaria. They wanted to reach the safe haven of Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, UK, all these countries who have a very stable economies, who have a very strong system of social welfare, where people could actually find jobs and have some future that will be completely different than the one they will have in the refugee camps or other parts of the world. This in itself has resulted in a severe measures of the European countries, because they didn't want such a huge influx of people in their territories for various reasons: cultural, financial, political, moral, and so on and so on. As the number of refugees have increased in these countries, the general population sentiment towards them have also changed. I mean, it's easy to be a humanitarian and morally active person when you deal with the suffering abroad and when you deal with distant others. But when you have to encounter this within your own society, within your own cities and your own environment, the sentiments change. Truth is that around 65% of general population do not want refugees in their societies among them. So the response of Europe in that kind of major influx of people was building walls. So Bulgaria built a wall along with Greece here. So basically what happened is that the ground route was impossible, was not existing anymore. What to some extent resulted in people taking a very difficult voyage across the seas in order to reach either Greek islands here or reach Sicily and Italy from Tunisia, Algeria, Libya. That in itself has created a massive issues. First of all, it has created a very shady smuggler business. Namely, people were smuggled. You have to pay in order to be provided transportation from, for example, mostly Turkish coast to one of these Greek islands. And as you could see from the case of Island Kurdi, that often what really happens is that these boats are overcrowded, that they are not really made for often very difficult seas. Not many people know how to swim. Not many people can actually afford life vest. Not many actually people have life vests at work, and often kind of results in a very tragic events like one with Alan Kurdi. So up to date, 33,000 people have drowned here in the Mediterranean. Thousands of people have drowned here in Aegean, and Island Kurdi was basically here. They tried to reach this island. So this is a number for only 2017, and very like first 3 months of 2017, like 30,000 people arrived by the sea. In 2016, this was the number. This is the number of dead and missing only for 3 months of 2017. Believe me, like until now, that number is like probably 10 times higher. So this is basically what refugee system is from the perspective of refugees herself or himself or themselves. These are the 4 choices that they actually have: either stay home, go to the refugee camp, experience violence, experience lack of any kind of human agency that actually makes us who we are, either then go to the urban areas of neighboring countries, or try to take a very dangerous trip and end up in one of the affluent Western societies where your life will probably be way better than these previous alternatives. So now, leaving this aside, I want to say a few words about what actually makes people leave their homes. We could see it from the definition of refugee, UNHCR, that system that refugees are only people who are actually escaping direct violence or conflict. But as you can see from this map, that's not really truth. I mean, it's not whole truth. In sociopolitical philosophy and political science and sociology, political geography, we use push factors and pull factors to explain like the causes of migration. So push factors are basically all factors that make people leave their homes. At one hand, they can be environmental, social, economic, or political. Environmental, of course, like climate change and disasters, environmental degradation. Many people do not really know that prior to the public uprising in Syria, there was like a 5-year-long drought. I mean, you have to understand that the source of conflict is not always one-dimensional. I mean, if I cannot provide food for my children due to the environmental reasons, and I go to my government that doesn't do anything in order to help the population, rather kind of takes a very rigid approach and a very oppressive approach, of course that I will try to organize myself and try to exercise my rights as citizens. And that was basically the case in Syria, that later kind of received a much more difficult economic and political shape when the big actors like US and Russia kind of got involved, not because they really care about lives of Syrian people, but because we all care about things that we put in our cars that cost some money and that we call oil and gas. So beside environmental reasons, there are social and economic reasons that are basically like poverty, unemployment. Another social reason can also be like the fear of persecution. If you're a member of certain ethnic, racial, or religious minority, there are always kind of reasons that are both social and political that kind of result in fear for your lives, and of course insecurity that nobody really wants to experience long term. So these are the factors that kind of make people leave their home. So what are the factors that make certain societies attract so many displaced people, like for example Germany, Sweden, UK, and so on? Well, these are pull factors. So basically, they attract people, they pull people to go to these societies. Of course, again, they're environmental, social, economic, and political. I mean, you could see that these are like complete opposites for what we could see here. Like, of course, there's a certain safety there, the like range of opportunities that I may have with my family there. There's a stability. There's also freedom of expression. I don't have to be concerned for being locked up or murdered simply because I express myself in a way that is against the major narrative of the leading forces within my society. And most importantly, there's this kind of economic stability and range of alternatives that I can have being employed there. And even if I'm not employed, due to a very strong welfare system, the state always provides some kind of aid. So I don't have to really worry that I will starve or be homeless or end up without any means of subsistence. I want to spend a few moments talking about environmental migrants, because there's an increased number of these people who are kind of forced to leave their homes due to environmental reasons, and they're not really recognized by the international community as people who invoke certain obligations, so they don't really receive any kind of aid. This has come to the forefront of public attention in the US last fall with all these natural disasters hitting our own territories, and especially taking into account what's going on in Puerto Rico, where like 75% of the population still don't have access to running water and electricity. So I think it's extremely important to understand that there has to be a change in the way how we understand what actually makes people, what is actually a justified reason for people to seek refuge in third countries. So environmental migrants are people who are forced to leave their home region due to sudden or long-term changes to their local natural and social environment. Such changes are held to include increased droughts, desertification, sea level rise, and disruption of seasonal weather patterns. The effect of these changes, of course, like lack of access to the water, lack of access to the food, incapacity to kind of have a safe existence and have safe shelter. So again, if you want to apply this predominant understanding of human rights as David Miller's account of global minimum, I mean, all these reasons actually trigger these remedial responsibilities from the Western actors. As you can see from this map shows two major sources of forceful displacement. So the blue one is environmental, where the displacement is caused by environmental causes, and the orange one is due to conflict. And you could see actually that the vast majority of people displaced are due to environmental concerns and causes, not so much due to the violence. And you can also identify the sites where conflict takes place. You could see that predominantly is in Africa and the Middle East and some parts of Asia. Central America and South America, while the environmental concerns you could see like hit everyone. Some less, of course, because the environmental resilience of affluent societies is much higher than, for example, developing countries like Bangladesh and so on and so on. So here you can see the global scale of displacement caused by disasters due to the violence, or like geophysical, 14%, and the weather, so climate, 86%. Now, I want to kind of say a few things how to transform the current refugee paradigm. So, first of all, I think it's necessary to expand the definition of the concept of refugees to include multifaceted account of forceful displacement like violence, environment, poverty, etc. That means that we have to increase the range of obligations that people who are escaping poverty or environmental degradation invoke on us. Take into account that every 5 seconds a child has died from poverty-related issues, either like medical or malnutrition and so on. Poverty kills more people than any death camp did during the Second World War, and it affects so many lives, not only abroad but also back home. And it's predominant cause of certain social pathologies like crime and violence. B, enable an environment for a just representation of refugees. Social inclusion depends on successful epistemic inclusion. And this is a bit more complex account. What I basically want to tackle with this point is that what I witness in Western Europe, especially in Austria and Germany, this kind of increased aggression against the refugees and newcomers from other cultures is this kind of cultural intolerance. And I think that has to be addressed through different means than just putting food into people's mouth. There has to be a way of establishing a dialogue between the host population and those people who are kind of coming from different cultural backgrounds, because the only way how you can work through these cultural, religious, social, and political differences is by enabling an environment where a dialogue and communication can actually take place, where people will actually understand their own standpoints and try to kind of adjust and balance these differences in a way that will allow peaceful coexistence. Giving investment and movement freedoms to refugees in host societies. That means, for example, that people who are in the refugee camps have freedom to be employed, have freedom to move around, leave the camps and not be warehoused in the camps like prisons. And you could see from documentary called Nomos what actually life in these refugee camps actually look like. It's not a form of aid, it's a form of control, it's a form of keeping away people from urban areas, from general population, and it's almost a form of, it's a tool actually to keep unwanted people away. 2 countries that have implemented investment and movement freedoms are Uganda and Brazil, and it has resulted in a huge benefits for everyone, not only for refugees but also for the host population, because many of these people who escape war, poverty, and so on are educated. They become entrepreneurs. They create businesses that employ host population as well. So it's basically a mutual benefit, allowing such agency to often completely marginalized people as refugees are. And final one that is kind of the consequence of these very tragic and turbulent attempts to reach the safety of Western countries is to implement humanitarian visas. And this is in itself, to some extent, something that has taken place in the past, in the aftermath of the First World War, where people were issued these Nansen passports that allow them to basically leave their homes and go to the country of their choice. And take into account that paying a smuggler to be smuggled out of Syria is around $1,200 to $1,600. Paying a smuggler from Turkey to be smuggled into Greece is again from $800 to $1,200. So you need around $3,000-4,000 just to be smuggled from Syria to Greek island, and yet there's no real promise that you will actually reach the safety of Western societies, because what's really taking place at the moment is that most of the people who kind of took the sea route and tried to seek asylum in European Union in the last 2-3 years, since the walls were built on the border, are still on the islands. They don't have freedom of movement, and these islands are actually becoming a huge refugee camps that increasingly result in violence and ongoing deprivation of both refugees themselves, but also of host citizens who live on these islands. Just ask yourself this, like the major primary income on Greek islands until the refugee crisis was tourism. Do you really think that the European tourist will actually go and spend vacation among the views of human suffering and misery? No. So the income of these people who live on the islands is also kind of diminished, what leads to increased violence towards refugees themselves. So finally, I want to kind of conclude this lecture with a few major points, and these are like why actually European societies do not want to take these people and actually exercise some of the responsibilities that they have. Because theoretically and based on the refugee discourse and international law, the management of refugees and forcefully displaced people should actually be a joint universal obligation that falls on all countries together. But in practice, the geographical proximity to the area of conflict results in increased burden of dealing with people who need aid, and that actually has to be changed, because most of the time these neighboring countries cannot really provide safety and normal life to people who are escaping horrors of war and disasters. So one of the major issues why the Europe is so adamant to provide aid and exercise solidarity and all these kind of international obligations that they have is, of course, the cultural and religious biases. You could see here the views of Muslim more negative in Eastern and Southern Europe. So you could see the Hungary, 72% of the population is unfavorable view of Muslims. Italy 69, Poland 66, Greece 65, Spain 50, and then as you go north, like these percentages is decreasing. Many Europeans concerned with security, economic repercussions of refugee crisis. So these are some of the major fears that actually exist. One is the refugees will increase the likelihood of terrorism in our country. Again, Hungary, Poland, Netherlands, Germany, Italy, all of the European countries highlight such fear. You can see the median is like 60% of the population actually thinks that influx of Muslim people that actually are like a majority of refugees is a danger to security of the society itself. Refugees are a burden on our country because they take our jobs and social benefits. So this is kind of economical aspect. You could see like, again, Hungary, Poland, most of these countries have a very significant influx of such understanding and bias within the country. And refugees in our country are more to blame for crime than other groups. So again, this is one of the aspects that to some extent sustains certain animosity towards incomers. So let's try to tackle all these major fears that Europe has. So, fear of Islam. Even if Europe decides to take in all 4 million of Syrian refugees, that will only increase overall European population of a Muslim origin from 4% to 5%, so we cannot really talk about Islamization of Europe. High birth rates of Muslim immigrants, and although this is actually true, Muslim population initially has higher birth rates, but that actually also lowers down and adjusts as the standard of living and education increase. So you can see here, like, although it is initially higher, it follows the same trend like with the non-Muslim population, because as the children get educated, as their life starts and life understandings change, their view on the world also change, and they kind of more become similar to the non-Muslim populations within the whole societies. Higher crime rates to immigrant population. Well, here I will take something from our home. Incarceration rates, native-born and new immigrants, and you could see that such a huge discrepancy. I mean, blue is U.S. citizens and these are immigrants, and you could see that there's no point or justification holding such belief actually true. What makes people criminals are often social conditions that don't leave them other choices than the ones that they take, that are actually very unfortunate. And collapse of social welfare systems. So there is a proven tendency that when given opportunity of employment, refugees integrate faster into the economic system of a whole society by paying taxes and often creating new employment opportunities for the host population. And this is actually true, especially if you take the situation in the Western Europe. Wherever you go in France, Germany, Austria, you could see that immigrants have stores, restaurants. These function only because they're paying taxes and keeping certain obligations met towards the state itself. And as long as you pay taxes, you actually support these welfare networks that make the life in these countries bearable. Finally, one of the things that I have frequently encountered in the classroom and in talking with the general public is that they think that property of certain technological gadgets like smartphones in the hands of refugees make them actually not look so deprived as they actually want to be seen. This is to some extent very problematic, because having a smartphone is today not a luxury. Is actually necessity, because refugees use smartphones for navigation and communication, because what frequently happens is that family members are kind of divided in different groups, and often this is the only way how they actually can communicate with each other. Also, like, there are like many refugee groups that explain friendly routes to the west where you should escape certain dangers. There are like lots of private militias in Balkans that kind of mistreat them. Then we of course have military in Turkey, Iran, that is very aggressive and violent towards refugees. So all these to some extent serves as a way of navigation, communication, and it's one of the most essential tools. I mean, just ask yourself, will you go on a dangerous trip without your phone? I mean, even when I go hiking, I cannot go without my phone, because what will I do in a case of emergency? So this is it. I'll post few videos from interviews with refugees that I have done in the past few years, and this task for Unit 2 in regard to forceful displacement is a bit different. I basically want you to do two things. So on the discussion forum for Unit 2, you will find my post with links to two websites. One is interactive story about refugee crisis, and the other one is a game that tries to bring experiences of forceful displaced people closer to us. I want you to access them, play them, and share your experiences, what you actually have learned from this interactive online environment in regard to the refugee crisis. In addition, there are two interviews in case. It's going to be in case studies section that I did with two unaccompanied young refugees last summer in Lesbos. Listen to what they have to say and identify major issues that refugees actually face today. Take into account that these two young gentlemen are about your age or a bit younger. So that's all. Thank you, and please, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me or post on the discussion forum. This is, of course, not the whole explanation of what's going on in the world in regard to refugees, but I think I try to give at least some hint about limits, challenges, and necessities of conditions that millions and millions of people endure today. Thank you so much.